moved to San Diego in 1990, and Ansarullah, who was the imam in this region, the Southwest region, called me and said, "I'm coming to visit you, and I have a surprise for you." And so he came, and when I opened the door, it was not only him visiting my home, it was beloved Sheikh Mubarak Ahmed Sahib, who was also visiting with him. So after we had our conversation and prayers, Sheikh Sahib said to me, "Why don't you tell your story about how you converted to Islam?" And now, so many years later, Sadr Sahib has provided me this opportunity to keep my word. We should take our words very seriously. We should always fulfill our pledges. So, Jazakumullah Hasan al Jaza. My journey to Ahmadiyyat. I was born as Daniel Howard Wilhite into a family of pious evangelical Pentecostal Christians in December 1948 in Middletown, Ohio. The church we attended was founded by one of my mother's older sisters, and many of my aunts, uncles, and cousins also attended the same church. It provided a very nurturing environment for me and my siblings and established a consciousness of religious principles that was the foundation of my moral and spiritual training. My mother was a most dutiful and pious lady who provided special attention to rearing her children to be courteous, respectful, and responsible. She took particular care to inculcate proper social etiquettes, self-confidence, and self-pride. My father was a man of few words and many talents. He was good-natured and kind. He studied the Bible daily and was a pious example for many. As one of the church's deacons, he often taught the adult Sunday school class, and the pastor sat as his student in that class. I was blessed to come from a family where spiritual and moral training was paramount, not only in my father's house, but in all, well, almost all, of my aunts and uncles' homes as well. Because my family name represented a certain standard of conduct in our community, the adults in the community held me to that standard as well. As a boy, when playing with other friends and our behavior became a bit mischievous, I would be the first to be reprimanded by those who knew my family. Often it sounded like this: "Wilhite, you know you don't behave like that. You better go home or I'll call your mother." This was a blessing that I didn't appreciate until much later in my life. It was a benefit of my loving parents and family. May Allah have mercy on them all and raise them in paradise, inshallah. I reached my adolescence in the 1960s, as the 60s began. The term 1960s does not really refer to that particular decade. It really refers to the period of tumultuous, interrelated political, social, and cultural upheaval, beginning in roughly 1963 with the assassination of President John Kennedy, and ending about 1974 with the Watergate scandal of President Nixon. We haven't come much farther, have we? This was the period I developed from adolescence to manhood, and the events and the tenor of the time shaped my perspective and outlook as a young man. The assassination of John Kennedy was a particularly traumatic event. I was just in the 9th grade. I was sitting in Mr. Norman's plane geometry class when he came in crying and delivered the shocking news. Dwayne Justice, you see, you can remember every detail about those moments. that change your life. Dwayne Justice cracked a joke which angered Mr. Norman, and we knew then that the news was real. Everyone was not only shocked, but the reality of our vulnerability began to sink in. If the President of the United States, the most powerful man in the world, was not safe in his own country and from his own people, then just how vulnerable were we? The social and political movement of Negroes to attain full status as American citizens was a powerful force in shaping the future of this country and was a huge influence on the minds of the youth of that era. Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is the iconic figure of that movement. However, many youths were more attracted to leaders who were more militant and confrontational in their approach to addressing these injustices. In stark contrast to the church-based civil rights movement was the Nation of Islam, a pseudo-Islamic movement whose spokesman was the fiery, reformed ex-con known as Malcolm X. The Nation of Islam advocated self-help and separation from whites. Malcolm's straight talk and manly stance was appealing to young men who questioned the strategy of Dr. King of putting women and children in imminent danger during his marches, and who questioned the benefit and sincerity of seeking integration. The Nation of Islam was my first contact with the concept of Islam. It was a positive experience which provided not only the notion of an alternative theology from Christianity, but also an alternative political perspective. The passivity of Christianity of turning the other cheek became juxtaposed with the concept of equitable retaliation. Of course, the strained and distorted theology of the Nation of Islam did not appeal to me. However, the concept of a world religion called Islam was worthy of exploration and consideration. The Vietnam War. It was raging in the mid-1960s, just as I was graduating from high school, and my generation provided fresh cannon fodder for the war machine. I was opposed to the war and used every means to resist going into the military. The body bags rolled in as death counts spiraled upward. Young men died far too young in a war they did not understand, compelled by a draft system that fed the voracious war machine. One of the byproducts of the war in Southeast Asia was the influx of drugs. Not only large amounts of high-grade marijuana and hashish, but highly addictive heroin. Heroin flooded the Black community across this country. This was certainly a strategy to suppress the growing Black consciousness and militancy of the youth. I will note here that as I reflect back on my friends who died in the war and my friends who died from heroin overdoses wins. Protect your children. The movie industry provided an assist to this effort to suppress positive Black consciousness by allowing filmmakers to make movies of the Black experience, some Black, that glamorized street life and criminal enterprise. Although it was a joy on one hand to see Black life depicted on the big screen, it also was another method of exploitation and mind control. It became the desire of many young men to emulate the slick street hustler and gangster, and I fell prey to both scourges of drugs and criminal life. The young man who grew up in a pious family was no longer recognizable. I was engrossed in street life. I was living with a lady and fathered my first son in that sad state. I became a heroin addict and a petty gangster. I was just reading Quran while I was waiting here. Let me read the verse that I was led to. And their deeds are like darkness in a vast, deep sea, which a wave covers, over which there is another wave, above which are clouds, layers of darkness, one upon another. When he holds out his hand, he can hardly see it, and he whom Allah gives no light, for him there is no light at all. That was the condition of my life. In January 1970, as we say, I caught a case. I was sentenced to 10 to 25 years in the Ohio State Reformatory in Mansfield, Ohio. If any of you have seen the movie Shawshank Redemption, have you seen that movie? That's where I spent the next 3 years, in that very prison. That is also where I first was introduced to Orthodox Islam. There was a room dedicated as a Sunni mosque in the prison on the same floor where I worked as a staff of the prison newspaper. The imam came from Cleveland on Fridays, and although I was curious, I never attended the service on Fridays. However, I did interview the inmate imam for an article for the newspaper. I became curious, and I became interested, and I began learning the true Islamic principles in some mosque etiquettes. We also had a Black Culture Club on the same floor near the newspaper office. I spent lots of time there because they had a great library of books on Black history, culture, and contemporary Black thought. There I was introduced to the writings of the Pan-Africanists such as Kwame Nkrumah, Jomo Kenyatta, Sekou Toure, Marcus Garvey, and other thought leaders like Frantz Fanon. That is also where I encountered the autobiography of Malcolm X and learned that he had become a Sunni Muslim after leaving the Nation of Islam, and actually he died as El Hajj Malik El Shabazz. Call him by that name, not Malcolm X. Although I never seriously thought of becoming a Muslim at that time, I had an entirely new perspective on Islam. My body, mind, and soul were healing from the abuse my previous lifestyle had wrought. I chose the name Ibrahim Naeem to represent a new path. After 3 years and 4 months, I was paroled from the prison in May of 1973. I realized the tremendous deficit I had to overcome. My beloved mother had died the year before I was incarcerated. My father had been supportive throughout my time in prison and had remarried just before my release. I had shamed and disgraced my family. I had shocked my community, and I had a young family to raise. I was an African-American man with a felony conviction. My only path forward was through education. I enrolled at Kent State University in January 1974 and undertook my studies with a sense of purpose and urgency. I now use the name that I had chosen for myself, Ibrahim Naeem, and everyone got to know me by that name, although my name was not legally changed at the time. I connected with some Sunni Muslims on campus and began attending Jumu'ah from time to time. The R&B group Kool and the Gang, are anybody familiar with that group? Okay. They came to our campus at Kent State University. Kent State University was a very famous university, and actually because of infamy. May 4th, 1970, 4 students were shot and killed by the Ohio State National Guard, and many others were wounded. I got to know some of those people when I got to Kent State who were still in wheelchairs. Anyway, they were there for a concert. I didn't attend the concert. I stayed in my favorite place on campus, the Institute of African American Affairs, an oasis of Black culture and learning. Kool and the Gang were Muslim, and they traveled with a sheikh, Sheikh Mohammed, and he didn't attend the concert either. Instead, he gave an unscheduled, unsolicited lecture in the Umbari Umbayo Hall. I was fortunate to be there. After his lecture, we chatted, and I decided to take my Kalima Shahada right there. I was now a Sunni Muslim. That summer, I went back to my hometown, Middletown, for the break. One day while at Douglas Park, I heard conga drums playing and went to investigate. There I met one of my classmates who had gone to each public school I had attended. Doug Watson had been my classmate from kindergarten through high school. You know, they used to separate you by the beginning of your last name, and you went steps through classes, all the same people with the same last names. We reestablished our friendship. I told him that I was a Muslim. He expressed his interest in Islam, and we began studying Islam together. Doug adopted the name Abdallah, and we often said prayers together and shared any literature on Islam we found. Abdallah enrolled in a barber college in Dayton, Ohio. He drove the 25 miles from our hometown to Dayton every day. One day he came to visit me with exciting news. He had found a mosque on Randolph Street in Dayton, Ohio. This was great news, but it was what he said next that was most shocking. "You won't believe who I saw in the mosque." "Who?" I replied. "Sonny Marbury. And he has totally changed." This was unexplainable to me, but I'll explain. In street life, one's reputation is built on their toughness, ruthlessness, and their encounters with the law. One's reputation precedes them. Although I had never personally met Sonny Marbury, his reputation was well known. One of his best friends and partners in crime was Big June, whom I knew well. Although I never knew his real name, Big June and Sonny were well known in the streets with reputations larger than life. I had been a wannabe gangster. These guys were the real thing. So I heard that Sonny was in the mosque and was totally changed, and it shocked me. I had to see for myself. The following Sunday, I went to the mosque. I met the imam, the respected Mian Ibrahim Sahib. May Allah have mercy on him and raise him to a high status in paradise. I also met Dul Wakar Yaqub, Haji Aminullah, Habib Shafiq, Abu Bakr, Umar Farouk, and several others. I didn't meet Sonny Marbury. Instead, I met a most distinguished, thoughtful, and pious gentleman named Al-Hajj Muzaffar Ahmed Zafar. He was totally changed from the person with the street reputation of which I was familiar. He was not only in the mosque was in him. The love and brotherhood the brothers exuded was palpable. I was introduced to basic beliefs of Ahmadis. My particular interest was in the concept of second coming of Messiah, as my Christian upbringing made this topic most relevant to me. I left the mosque with several books, Invitation to Ahmadiyyat, Ahmadiyyat, the True Islam, and the phone numbers of several of the brothers. I also left with the question of what about Islam Ahmadiyyat could change Sonny Marbury into Muzaffar Ahmed Zafar. I began reading the books and pamphlets, and a whole new understanding opened to me. The unanswered questions I had from Christianity were answered with clarity and logic. The dubious interpretations of biblical scripture I had been taught were obliterated with the light of the promised Messiah's books. I signed bad in 1975 and began my journey as an Ahmadi Muslim. In July of 1978, I moved to Los Angeles to attend grad school at USC. Although I knew no one in the Los Angeles Ahmadi community, by the grace of Allah, it only took one phone call to connect with the Jamaat. I looked in the yellow pages Some of you, if there's any youngsters, they probably don't know what that is. I looked in the yellow pages for the name, last name Ahmed, because if you're Ahmadi, there's a good chance. Then I look for someone with the first name Muzaffar. I dialed the number. I asked if he was Ahmadi. The answer was G. I had found my new home, and by the grace of Allah, I have maintained that relationship to this day and have been honored to serve in several capacities. I would like to acknowledge those special, beautiful people who have embraced me, nurtured me, and supported my development. However, time will not permit that, nor do I dare attempt to mention them for fear of omissions. Let me encourage us all instead to embrace and nurture every new convert that you meet as your own spiritual children. Get to know them, teach them lovingly. It is because of the love and support of so many that I can say, Alhamdulillah, I am Ahmadi Muslim after 44 years. Jazakallah. रोशनी का सफर